Welcome to Voluble Minds, reflections on and abbreviated readings of famous philosophical dialogues. I'm Colin Wulff, Assistant Director of Religious Education at the Fourth Universalist Society in New York City. If you would like to skip the introductory segment on today's philosopher and dialogue and go straight to the reading, the timestamp posted in the video description will help you to do that. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to our George Berkeley unit. Irish Bishop George Berkeley, who lived from 1685 to 1753, was in some ways anticipated by Nicolas Malebranche of our last unit, who published his Dialogues on Metaphysics and Religion 3 years after Berkeley was born. Berkeley's immaterialism or idealism is what most survives of his legacy. This idealism was not in contrast to practicality, as we use the term colloquially today, but rather a contrast to materiality. Idealism as a philosophical movement has undergone several permutations in the centuries following Berkeley, perhaps most prominently in the German school, to which there are many famous contributors. Berkeley criticized Malebranche for continuing to leave open the possibility of a corporeal world. He believed that all the characteristics in the world around us can be wholly defined by the sensations by which we know them. These he called ideas, the ultimate source of which was God. So this idealism, while comparable to Plato's in that it regards ideas as in and of themselves constituting a reality, differs from Plato in that Berkeley does not think there can be an existent ideal underlying form of a common idea. He didn't just think, as Plato did, that such a thing was imperceptible in this shadow life, but that it was conceptually nonsensical. He believed that we are only capable of actually thinking of so-called abstract ideas in particulars. This leads him to the belief that there can be no such thing as substantial matter divorced from the specific forms it is said to take, hence immaterialism. For Berkeley, whatever is common between two experiences, say, of love, that makes them both recognizable feelings of love, cannot be extracted from the given instances in which love occurs. He thought this was a fundamental proof about the nature of reality and the non-existence of matter. It follows from this that if love could not be, as Plato thought, an underlying reality we might hope to encounter in the realm of ideals, that evil couldn't be a substance in and of itself either. So look for a brief throwback to Augustine's privative evil, in which badness is deterioration or the straying from a nobler path, rather than constituting a positive action, object, substance, or event. The term idea for objects not originating in our minds, as Berkeley acknowledges, can be tricky. He clarifies in this dialogue that he uses it rather to indicate a necessary connection to the mind. The means by which we know even external things is our perception, and our perceptions are in the mind, and thus ideas. But Berkeley makes a distinction between the fuzzier, less coherent ideas of the imagination and dreams, which are specific to our own minds, and those ideas sustained by the mind of God, which can be shared externally, continue to exist even when we aren't directly encountering them, and constitute the reality we perceive. We mentioned in our Malebranche section how this recalls the contest between the pre-Socratics Parmenides and Gorgias, the former believing that all that could be conceived must exist, since there can be no halfway point between existence and non-existence, so much for the powers of imagination, and the latter making fun of this view. Berkeley somewhat echoes Parmenides, but rather than saying that what is conceivable necessarily exists, he is saying that all that exists does so by being conceived, first by God and then apprehended by our senses. So Berkeley isn't calling reality into question so much as its rendering in matter, which he believes cannot exist. The ideas or perceptions God generates for our experience are in themselves a shared reality. We will discuss some problems with idealism in the post-dialogue section of this episode, but Berkeley was certainly onto something interesting. The only way we know how to describe anything we encounter in life is by way of its effect on our senses. If that is so, why couldn't our entire worldly experience be nothing but the excitation of our senses in the form of the ideas they communicate? How can we ever really verify that worldly objects are substantial beyond these perceivable attributes? Later philosophers like Immanuel Kant and Bertrand Russell would say that while this may raise good questions about human reason and perception, it's less valid to assume that our limitations of perspective must then be projected onto the inherent qualities of the world and natural order of which we are a part. In other words, being necessarily limited, as we are in our understanding of the world by what we can detect and consider of it, there is no more compelling reason to assume that there is nothing but what we perceive in it than to assume that there is much more to the world than what we can perceive. Both approaches confound our powers of verification. Leading transcendentalist, essayist, and sometimes rather careless and unaccountable poetic, sermonic philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson dismissed the whole debate, choosing to focus on how nature's effect made him feel, rather than its underlying reality or possible immaterialism. In his essay, Nature, Emerson writes, in my utter impotence to test the authenticity of the report of my senses, to know whether the impressions they make on me correspond with outlying objects, what difference does it make whether Orion is up there in heaven or some god paints the image in the firmament of the soul? Whether nature enjoy a substantial existence without, or is only in the apocalypse of the mind, it is alike useful and alike venerable to me. Be it what it may, it is ideal to me, so long as I cannot try the accuracy of my senses. In its essentials, this is probably what most of us must resort to in practical terms on this question, because it's true, there's not much we can do about it in the normal course of our affairs. Though, if science had stopped at this sanctimonious shrug, we would have far less of an idea about the correspondences of the senses to our environment than we do now, and if Emerson had exhibited this sudden recourse to testability and usefulness more regularly, it's hard to see his own spiritual movement getting very far. Inconsistency was both the low conceptual ceiling and the hazy qualitative saving grace for Emerson's contributions to thought. The more dogmatic Berkeley was prepared to go down with his precepts. He more or less has. This concept of idealism and other matters are discussed in our first Berkeley selection, Three Dialogues Between Hylas and Philonous, written in 1713. George Berkeley and our next unit subject, David Hume, are both considered empiricists as opposed to rationalists such as Leibniz and Descartes, though this designation can be imprecise. They also both leverage the term skeptic in wily reversals against their opposites in dialogue. This actually is part of the difficulty in really distinguishing between a pure rationalistic and pure empirical view. While empiricists in general accept that the senses necessarily frame human experience, not all of them go as far as Berkeley in suggesting that the actual world without must be defined by the limitations of the senses. Hume was not ready to say that there is no such thing as matter, but simply that our senses are not totally adequate for understanding its nature. And Berkeley, as you will hear in this dialogue in the character of Philonous, is very ready to claim common sense reason for his own position, empiricist though we call him, which suggests he is less insistent on distinguishing between human faculties of a priori cognition and immediate perception than Hume, though Berkeley does draw that line at pure imagination. This is one of the more vigorous and evenly distributed dialogues in our series, and it appears Hylas is given a fighting chance. But at the same time, Berkeley's style is possibly the most caustic and snippy when confronting disagreement. He dispenses with the more self-deprecatory voice Plato gives Socrates in his dialogues, and while the effect may be less patronizing, it means that any assumptions Berkeley too readily grants his mouthpiece can be all the more irritating and, by our time, poorly aged. To manage the bracing volleys of this piece and to impart some dignity and respectability into Berkeley's strawman Hylas, I'm joined today by one-take wonder John Hardin. John is an excellent classical actor, academic tutor, expert chess teacher, and my good friend. His most recent project is his live-streamed instructional chess show, Acceptable Chess, which airs Tuesday and Thursday evenings at www.twitch.tv/acceptablechess. He will be reading Hylas to my Philonous. Please enjoy these selections from George Berkeley's Three Dialogues Between Hylas and Philonous. The work is in the public domain. Stick around for the post-dialogue reflection for more.
I am glad to find there was nothing in the accounts I heard of you.
What, if you please, were they?
In last night's conversation, you were represented as someone who maintains the most extravagant opinion that ever entered into the mind of man, namely, that there is no such thing as material substance in the world.
I seriously believe that there is no such thing as what philosophers call material substance. But if I were made to see anything absurd or skeptical in this, then I would have the same reason to renounce this belief as I think I have now to reject the contrary opinion.
What? Can anything be more fantastical, more in conflict with common sense, or a more obvious piece of skepticism than to believe there is no such thing as matter?
Steady on, Hylas. What if it were to turn out that you, who hold that there is matter, are, by virtue of that opinion, a greater skeptic, and maintain more paradoxes and conflicts with common sense than I, who believe no such thing.
You have as good a chance of convincing me that the part is greater than the whole as of convincing me that I must give up my belief in matter if I am to avoid absurdity and skepticism.
Well then, are you content to accept as true any opinion that turns out to be the most agreeable to common sense and most remote from skepticism?
With all my heart. Since you want to start arguments about the plainest things in the world, I am content, for once, to hear what you have to say.
Tell me, please, Hylas, what do you mean by a skeptic?
I mean what everyone means. Someone who doubts everything.
So, if someone has no doubts concerning some particular point, then with regard to that point, he cannot be thought a skeptic.
I agree with you.
Does doubting consist in accepting the affirmative or the negative side of a question?
Neither. Anyone who understands English must know that doubting signifies a suspense between the two sides.
So, if someone denies any point, he can no more be said to doubt concerning it than he who affirms it with the same degree of assurance.
True.
And so, his denial no more makes him a skeptic than the other is.
I acknowledge it.
Then how does it happen, Hylas, that you call me a skeptic because I deny what you affirm, namely the existence of matter? For all you know, I may be as firmly convinced in my denial as you are in your affirmation.
Hold on a moment, Philonous. My definition of skeptic was wrong, but you can't hold a man to every false step he makes in conversation. I did say that a skeptic is someone who doubts everything, but I should have added who denies the reality and truth of things.
What things? Do you mean the principles and theorems of science? But these, you know, are universal intellectual notions and have nothing to do with matter, so that the denial of matter doesn't imply the denial of them.
I agree about that, but what about other things? What do you think about distrusting the senses, denying the real existence of sensible things, or claiming to know nothing of them? Isn't that enough to qualify a man as a skeptic?
Well then, let us see which of us it is that denies the reality of sensible things or claims to have the greatest ignorance of them, since, if I understand you rightly, he is to be counted the greater skeptic.
That is what I desire.
Does the reality of sensible things consist in being perceived, or is it something different from their being perceived, something that doesn't involve the mind?
To exist is one thing, and to be perceived is another.
I'm talking only about sensible things. My question is, by the real existence of one of them, do you mean an existence exterior to the mind and distinct from their being perceived?
I mean a real, absolute existence, distinct from and having no relation to their being perceived.
So, if heat is granted to have a real existence, it must exist outside the mind.
It must.
Tell me, Hylas, is this real existence equally possible for all degrees of heat that we feel? Or is there a reason why we should attribute it to some degrees of heat and not to others? If there is, please tell me what it is.
Whatever degree of heat we perceive by sense, we can be sure exists also in the object that occasions it.
What, the greatest as well as the least?
Yes, because the same reason holds for both. They are both perceived by sense. Indeed, the greater degree of heat is more intensely, sensibly perceived. So if there is any difference, it is that we are more certain of the real existence of a greater heat than we can be of the reality of a lesser.
But isn't the most fierce and intense degree of heat a very great pain?
No one can deny that.
And can any unperceiving thing have pain or pleasure?
Certainly not.
Is your material substance a senseless thing, or does it have sense and perception?
It is senseless, without doubt.
So it can't be the subject of pain.
Indeed, it can't.
Nor, consequently, can it be the subject of the greatest heat perceived by sense, since you agree that this is a considerable pain.
I accept that.
Then what are we to say about your external object? Is it a material substance, or is it not?
It is a material substance with the sensible qualities inhering in it.
But then how can a great heat exist in it, since you agree it cannot exist in a material substance? Please clear up this point.
Hold on, Philonous. I'm afraid I went wrong in granting that intense heat is a pain. I should have said, not that the pain is the heat, but that it is the consequence or effect of the heat.
There is more. Are material objects in themselves perceptible or imperceptible?
Properly and immediately, nothing can be perceived but ideas. All material things, therefore, are in themselves insensible and can be perceived only through ideas of them.
Ideas are sensible then, and their originals, the things they are copies of, are insensible?
Right.
But how can something that is sensible be like something that is insensible? Can a real thing in itself invisible be like a color? Can a real thing that isn't audible be like a sound? In a word, can anything be like a sensation or idea, but another sensation or idea?
I must admit that I think not.
Can there possibly be any doubt about this? Don't you perfectly know your own ideas?
Yes, I know them perfectly, for something that I don't perceive or know can't be any part of my idea.
Well, then, examine your ideas and then tell me if there's anything in them that could exist outside the mind, or if you can conceive anything like them existing outside the mind.
Upon looking into it, I find that I can't conceive or understand how anything but an idea can be like an idea. And it is most evident that no idea can exist outside the mind.
So, you're forced by your own principles to deny the reality of sensible things because you made it consist in an absolute existence outside the mind. That is to say, you are a downright skeptic. So, I have met my target, which was to show that your principles lead to skepticism. Now I want to know in the first place whether, given that motion is not action, you can conceive any action other than volition. In the second place, whether to say something and conceive nothing is not to talk nonsense. And lastly, whether, having considered the premises, you don't see that it is highly absurd and unreasonable to suppose that our ideas have any efficient or active cause other than spirit.
I give up the point entirely. But although matter may not be a cause, what blocks it from being an instrument subservient to the supreme agent in the production of our ideas?
An instrument, you say? Please tell me about the shape, springs, wheels, and motions of that instrument.
I don't claim to be able to do that because both this substance and its qualities are entirely unknown to me.
What? So you think it is made up of unknown parts and has unknown motions and an unknown shape?
I don't think it has any shape or motion at all because you have convinced me that no sensible qualities can exist in an unperceiving substance.
But what notion can we possibly have of an instrument that has no sensible qualities, not even extension?
I don't claim to have any notion of it.
And what reason do you have to think that this unknown and inconceivable something does exist? Is it that you think God cannot act as well without it, or that you find by experience that some such thing is at work when you form ideas in your own mind?
You are always nagging me for reasons for what I believe. What reasons do you have for not believing it?
For me, seeing no reason for believing something is a sufficient reason for not believing it. But setting aside reasons for believing, you will not so much as let me know what it is you want me to believe, since you say you have no sort of notion of it. I beg you to consider whether it is like a philosopher, or even like a man of common sense, to claim to believe you know not what and you know not why. It seems then that you include in your present notion of matter nothing but the general abstract of idea of entity or thing.
Nothing else, except that I add to this general idea of thing the negation of all those particular things, qualities, or ideas that I perceive, imagine, or in any way apprehend.
Where, please, do you suppose that this unknown matter exists?
Oh, Philonous! Now you think you have entangled me, for if I say it exists in some place, you will infer that it exists in the mind, since we agree that place or extension exists only in the mind. But I am not ashamed to admit my ignorance. I don't know where it exists, but I am sure It doesn't exist in a place. There is a negative answer for you, and such answers are all you can expect to get for all your remaining questions about matter.
Since you won't tell me where it exists, please inform me about how you suppose it to exist, or what you mean by saying that it exists.
It neither thinks nor acts, neither perceives nor is perceived.
But what positive content is there in your abstracted notion of its existence?
When I look into it carefully, I don't find that I have any positive notion or meaning at all. I tell you again, I am not ashamed to admit my ignorance. I don't know what is meant by its existence or how it exists.
Keep up this frankness, good Hylas, and tell me sincerely whether you can form a distinct idea of entity in general, abstracting from and excluding all thinking and corporeal beings, all particular things whatsoever.
Hold on, let me think a little. I, I confess, Philonous, I don't find that I can.
Here is where I think we have got to. Please tell me if I'm wrong. You attributed existence outside the mind first to the immediate objects of our perceptions. This came from your belief in material substance, then to their archetypes, the things of which they are copies, then to their causes, then to instruments, then to occasions, and lastly to something in general, which on examination turns out to be nothing. So matter comes to nothing.
But how, according to your views, do real things differ from chimeras formed by the imagination or the visions of a dream, since according to you, they are all equally in the mind?
The ideas formed by the imagination are faint and indistinct. Also, they are entirely dependent on the will. But the ideas perceived by sense, that is, real things, are more vivid and clear. And they don't in that way depend on our will, because they are imprinted on our mind by a spirit other than us. So there's no danger of mixing up these real things with the foregoing ideas formed by the imagination, and equally little danger of failing to distinguish them from the visions of a dream, which are dim, irregular, and confused. And even if dreams were very lively and natural, they could easily be distinguished from realities by their not being coherently connected with the preceding and subsequent episodes of our lives. In short, whatever method you use to distinguish things from chimeras is obviously available to me too. For any such method must, I presume, be based on some perceived difference, and I don't want to deprive you of any one thing that you perceive.
But still, Philonous, you hold that there is nothing in the world but spirits and ideas. You must admit that this sounds very odd.
I agree that the word idea, not being commonly used for thing, sounds a little peculiar. I used it because it implies a necessary relation to the mind, and it is now commonly used by philosophers to stand for the immediate objects of the understanding. But however odd the proposition may sound in words, there's nothing very strange or shocking in what it means, which in effect amounts merely to this: that there are only perceiving things and perceived things, or that every unthinking being is necessarily, from the very nature of its existence, perceived by some mind. If not by any finite created mind, then certainly by the infinite mind of God, in whom we live and move and have our being. Is this as strange as to say that sensible qualities aren't in the objects? Or that we can't be sure of the existence of things or know anything of their real natures, although we see and feel them and perceive them by all our senses?
Don't we have to infer from this that there are no such things as physical or corporeal causes, but that a spirit is the immediate cause of all the phenomena in nature? Can there be anything more extravagant than this?
Yes, there can. It is infinitely more extravagant to say that an inert thing operates on the mind and an unperceiving thing causes our perceptions. Anyway, the view that you, for some reason, find so extravagant is no more than the Holy Scriptures assert in 100 places. In them, God is represented as the sole and immediate cause of all those effects that some heathens and philosophers customarily attribute to nature, matter, fate, or some such unthinking agent. There's no need for me to support this with particular citations. Scripture is full of it.
You aren't aware, Philonous, that in making God the immediate cause of all the motions in nature, you make him the author of murder, sacrilege, adultery, and the like heinous sins.
In answer to that, I remark first that a person's guilt is the same whether he performs an action with or without an instrument. So if you think that God acts through the mediation of an instrument or occasion called matter, you make him the author of sin just as much as I do through my view that he is the immediate agent in all those operations that common people ascribe to nature. I further remark that sin or wickedness does not consist in the outward physical action or movement, but in something internal, the wills departing from the laws of reason and religion. By your own admission, therefore, nothing is new, nothing begins to be in respect of the mind of God. So we are agreed on that point.
Then what are we to make of the creation?
Can't we understand it to have been entirely in the respect of finite spirits? On that understanding of it, things, with regard to us, can properly be said to begin their existence or be created when God decreed that they should become perceptible to intelligent creatures in the order and manner which he then established and which we now call the laws of nature. Welcome to the post-dialogue reflection for Hylas and Philonous. Idealism can be a seductive notion because it specifically plays on the testable limits of our imaginations. Try to imagine a dog, and you will likely find it challenging to do so without also bringing to mind a particular dog with its own dimensions or fur color. If you were to strip away all such particularities, Berkeley says, you would not have an ideal general dog form left, but rather nothing. For anything recognizable as a dog would still have to have the shape and size or features specific enough to activate whatever sense you first use in recognizing a dog. However, this actually leaves out some important considerations of how human imagination works. Let's assume Berkeley's visual focus for the nonce. In suggestive or abstract or outright symbolic imagery, we can actually come pretty close to representing things like a tree or a dog without committing to many of the characteristics that point to a particular kind of tree or breed of dog. Berkeley would argue, however, that inevitably certain varieties in each case would be excluded, and that your drawing may not resemble any prior dog or tree, but would be, nonetheless, a particular dog or tree the moment it was rendered with so many branches and leaves and dimensions. But when a person imagines an object in nothing but visual abstraction, size becomes purely relative in the headspace, and even proportion is rarely assigned in a precise eidetic fashion, but rather many of us do actually hold quite loosely in our minds a shifting, blurry impression of the general idea sans any characteristics more particular than those features common to every member of that idea's category. Vague colors and shapes metamorphose so rapidly as we try to make a clear vision coalesce in competition with what the senses are still bringing in from the external world. And if we try to freeze a frame in that, it can all dissipate. What actually goes on in the mind and is available to us perceptibly when we imagine things visually is much more complicated and varied than Berkeley could possibly have understood in his time. So we'll give him some slack on that count. However, we needn't assume visualization as being synonymous with abstract conception. The word imagination etymologically implies image, but in our actual exercise of it, we're way beyond that. And this was a fact to which Berkeley had plenty of access, and yet he never really admits to it without demurring as to its implications for his theory. A primary example of this is when Berkeley admits to the possibility of a more nuanced category by allowing that words essentially serve the purpose of abstraction, even if we can't perfectly visualize the common abstract elements of which they can be signs. Our dialogue, Alciphron, will cover this in the next episode. But Berkeley rather arbitrarily decides that this doesn't count as proof that immediate human perception can't compass the entirety of existence. In trying to apply visualization as the common standard for concepts to which it isn't even applicable, he creates his own problem to confirm his preferred solution for it. Well, that's just Theology 101. You could say it's a general practice, and we can't place much significance in Berkeley's particulars. Going back again to the imaginary dog example, let's say all the physical features by which we recognize a dog are actually inappropriate to a definitional determination of dog, and in many respects they are, if we're speaking strictly in terms of speciation. The pet dog, Canis familiaris, is a direct descendant of the gray wolf, Canis lupus, They share a genus, but are different species. A gray wolf, then, is not a dog as we commonly mean the term for our domesticated companions. We could imagine all manner of animals resembling but not belonging to the dog category. What defines a dog genetically, then, whatever its breed, is its ability to produce offspring with other dogs. And while we can see the offspring and are sometimes caught off guard by unselfconscious displays of the process of making them at the park, the defining feature of the dogness in question does not consist essentially of a visual component, but of processes that can happen to take a visual instance or representation when we encounter them directly. We can read a genetic code, but the state of reproductive compatibility is not in itself a visual state, but a physical one. In rightly criticizing Plato for thinking common abstractions could visibly materialize without particulars, Berkeley falls short of realizing that this is because visual rendering is only one narrow mode in which concepts may be expressed and interpreted, and thus he still confines himself to it in developing his own explanation for existence. In other words, he rebuts Plato's belief of what exists by accepting Plato's premise as to what affirms existence. Well, thanks for staying for the post dialogue. Are there workarounds to these problems with idealism? In our next dialogue, Alciphron, we will continue to grapple with this brain straining concept. See you next time.